Hey guys, big day today in the sense that we are learning our last graph and also going over our last concept here that we need to touch base on before the AP exam. Okay, so we're beginning to practice later this week, early next week. But anyway, getting into this last concept here. We've mentioned it here and there. It's referred to as the Phillips curve. Okay, and the Phillips curve has three. They refer to them sometimes as generalizations, okay? And the things that we've got to understand is that probably most importantly, and we've mentioned before that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, okay? So remember we talked about when the economy's doing really well, unemployment goes down, but that means people make more money, which means they're going to spend more money, which means inflation goes up, okay? Now, we also know that if we have a supply shock, which we haven't really used that term, a supply shock would be like an increase in the price of oil, for example, is the example that we've used a couple different times, is that it can create higher inflation and higher unemployment. The fancy term for that is stagflation. Some of you guys in your U.S. history classes might have talked about that here and there. All right. And the third thing that we're going to realize is that there's no significant trade-off between inflation and unemployment over long periods of time. Okay. So you don't have to have these things memorized. If you're a memorizer person, okay, then by all means try to memorize it. But if you can get familiar with the graph, which is is obviously going to be the goal by the end of the day today. Okay, if you can get familiar with the graph, you're going to be all right. Okay, and you're going to see that it's going to tie into the aggregate demand curve and what we do with our price level and our output and stuff like that. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a general idea of what's going on. Okay, just a quick review of some tips that I use to help me get this Phillips curve figured out, which I don't have drawn yet. But remember our aggregate demand curve over here, and I left off the long run aggregate supply. Okay, we're going to take this step by step here for a second. Okay, I left that off. Remember, okay, our price level simply is another word for kind of like inflation, right? So we usually don't put a percentage over here, but understand that inflation, our price level is going to go somewhere from like 0 to 100%, so to speak, right? And down here, we also said, okay, output, we're going to assume when we output more stuff, when we produce more stuff, that we've eventually got to hire more people, right? So unemployment's going to decrease. All right. And we also said that if we called this line output, and we know that this can kind of go from visually 0%, right, employment, okay, out to 100% employment, okay, that we can it's going to help us out as we do this Phillips curve. Okay, so I've added a few different things to our axes here just to give us a visual. Now, in a real test-taking situation, I would maybe add these if you're comfortable in what you're doing. I would add these in, within your like scrap paper, right? If you're getting stuck. So what I did was I took employment, and it's in green here, okay, and I just marked as some hypothetical numbers, okay. So 90% employment, 95% employment, and 100% employment. Now, also what I did was in red, I wrote unemployment, okay? And so the reason I did that is because we usually talk in the terms of unemployment. Our graph over here is going to talk about unemployment, okay, rather than employment. But if you can make that connection between the opposite of the two, it's going to help you out with this Phillips curve, okay? And then over here, I also gave us some percentages, again, hypothetical. They're not showing up super good on my computer. 3% inflation, 5% inflation, 7% inflation. Okay. And so again, what we're going to eventually see as of right now, right? Our inflation rate is 5%. Our unemployment rate is also 5% at this particular equilibrium. Okay. So we're going to take that over, and we're going to do our Phillips curve, over here. Now, if you remember, one of the first things we talked about when I was talking about how to remember how to label these axes, that our y-axis was always going to have to do with some sort of pricing. Okay, so the nice thing is that stays true for our Phillips curve. Our Phillips curve has two axes. It has our inflation axis, okay? And it has our unemployment axis. Okay, and so those two axes are what obviously is what eventually is going to occur with our line here. Okay, so just real simple. All right, it's not anything fancy. Our Phillips curve is going to do something like that. Okay, it's going to be downward sloping, and for the most part, that's what you need to know. And I'm just going to label this. I'm going to get a step ahead. I'm going to call this the short run Phillips curve. Okay, so SRPC. All right, in terms of what we're looking at. So if we tie these two graphs together, okay, what this wants to show us is, again, this gives us, our aggregate demand graph gives us some equilibrium, right? And so right here, we're calling this equilibrium. If we drag this across, right, we're just going to call that 5%. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, we know that it's going to be 5%. We're going to be on this dot right here. Let's call it X, okay? And we also know that our unemployment rate, okay, is going to be 5% from here. Now, here's the tricky part about what I just showed you with kind of my cheating here, okay, is that this is our unemployment line now. Okay, so it goes from 0, and let's just top it off at like 20% over here. Okay, so it goes from 0% to 20%. Okay, so obviously right here, our unemployment is going to be 5%. Okay, and we have this point. If this is our level of output, if this is our short run equilibrium, that's our level of output. Now, let's see what happens here if we shift our demand curve. So if we shift our demand curve here, our aggregate demand curve, okay, so we have some level of increased demand, right? So maybe we're trying to fix a recessionary gap, or maybe, the government has decided to, lower taxes, whatever, whether they're trying to fix something, whatever. People's incomes have increased. Okay, there's a few different things that increase our aggregate demand. We know that also includes like business investment. And again, sometimes people just change their minds. Just as a quick review from before, maybe it comes from, prices abroad increase. So if prices abroad in other countries increase, well, now I got to buy stuff from the United States, right, domestically to cover that. So let's just increase our demand here and kind of see what happens to our new line, okay? So we're going to shift our demand curve over to the right, all right? Now, that's going to give us a new equilibrium point, right? It's going to match up, in this case, with our 7%. And it's also going to match up with, let's call that 97%, okay, or 3% unemployment, okay? So we have a situation where we have gone up to now, in this case, all right, a new point, let's call it Y, all righty? And this is our 7% inflation rate. Okay, and we're also going to see that down here, our Phillips curve is going to show us that we get to this point right here. We're going to call it 3% unemployment. And so our Phillips curve is showing us the relationship between these two graphs, right? And kind of proving the point that, again, if we can say that our output and unemployment are related to each other, then we can also draw this Phillips curve. Okay, let's try to do the same thing if we decrease our Phillips curve here, our aggregate demand curve. Okay, so again, for whatever reason, let's just say that, that, again, we have this coronavirus thing, right? So people are like, okay, I'm not going outside, I'm not spending money. Let's shift this demand curve back over to the left instead. Okay, so I'm gonna call this AD2. Okay, and again, we have a new equilibrium point, correct? We're going to match that up with our 3% inflation. All righty. And we're also going to match that up with, we'll call that 10% unemployment. Okay. Well, let's see if it matches up over here. Okay. So we got this. All right. Matches up over here. We've got 3% inflation. And also it's proven our point over here that it's going to put us up to 10% unemployment. Okay, so I'll just call that point, let's just call it Z. All righty. So They don't really necessarily interact perfectly with each other, but if you understand what this axis over here, this output axis is showing us, we can prove our point over here. Okay, so here's the rule that you need to remember here. Aggregate demand, an aggregate demand shift, okay, is going to result in movement along the Phillips curve. This word here is shifts. I know I got a light shining right on there. Okay, so aggregate demand shifts result in movement along the Phillips curve. You can memorize that if you want. That might be you. That's not how my brain works. I've got to understand what's going on in this whole mess over here. And again, I'll give you some secondary resources and we'll have some practice with it. Okay. And I added over here a little bit to kind of say, okay, right? If we have, if we have expansion or expansionary policy, right? Well, we know that's going to move us from, in this case, X to Y. That's going to increase inflation, decrease unemployment. That's the stuff that we've been talking about. Now we're just putting stuff on a graph, obviously. And if we move from X to Z in this point, right, that's going to be a contraction of our economy where it leads to inflation decreasing and unemployment increasing. Okay, so I hope that makes sense with the demand side of things. I realize that things are obviously pretty messy up there. Do your best to kind of walk through it. You might have to watch the video a second time. All right, we will do the supply shifter, the supply shocks next. Okay, so I reset things here a little bit. And what you can see is obviously I used the same label. So we got our 5% inflation. Again, probably not a number you would put on a normal aggregate demand graph, right? But we're trying to prove a point a little bit. So our price level is that 5% there. And I used the same numbers down here for it. I only put unemployment on there. Okay, remember, unemployment's got to go backwards. It's not a perfect label, okay? But understand what's occurring and understand why I'm putting that on there so we can translate it onto our Phillips curve over here. Okay, so let's say that we have the price of oil increase dramatically. Okay, so maybe we have an embargo with the Middle East like we saw in the 1970s and early 80s. We also had a shortage of fuel back in the late 2000s that led partly to the most previous recession we were in. And again, let's decrease our aggregate supply. So remember, especially in the case of like oil, okay, I mean, that has everything to do with everything. That goes into the cost of what we buy. That goes into the cost of shipping things, right? So obviously an extremely important resource. So we have a new short run equilibrium over here, right? So our short run equilibrium now, let's call this price level 7%. Okay, so our price level has gone up. Well, the challenge is our output's also gone down. Okay, so our output has also created, let's just call this an 8% unemployment down here. Well, the problem is now our price level's gone up and our unemployment has also increased. Okay, so price level / inflation has increased and unemployment has increased, right? Well, the problem with that is that when we go this way, inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. If we come this way, inflation goes down, unemployment goes up, okay? So we've got to make both increase. So the way that we make them both increase is we've got to shift our short-run Phillips curve out to the right. Okay, so we've got a new short-run Phillips curve. And now we can say, all right, we've got this number here. Okay, here's our 7% inflation, right? And it's also going to say that we have 8% unemployment. So a supply shift shifts the Phillips curve. Okay, you don't need to remember that as much as if you just remember what our graph is showing us here, and you can kind of remember these little tricks on these axes. Okay, so for you rules memorizers, okay, a shift in the short run aggregate supply results in a shift of the Phillips curve, and you can even add that it goes in the opposite direction. Okay, let's finish this out. Let's just increase our supply. So let's just say we have a new technology where we don't have to consume as much fuel, whatever the case may be. We have an increase in supply of fuel. Okay, so let's just shift it, check our work here. Okay, and we've got a new unemployment rate. Let's call that 3%. Okay, we've got a new inflation rate. Let's call that 3%. Okay, well, again, we're still in this same boat over here, right? We can't get this to match up. And so if we shift our short run aggregate supply to the right, we've got to shift our Phillips curve to the left. And now our information is going to make sense. All right. So again, probably a little bit more difficult concept. It's going to take you some more practice than just saying, okay, that kind of makes sense. We're going to give you some practice problems with this short run Phillips curve. And again, hopefully things start to make sense. This looks way more complicated than what it needs to be. I'm describing what happens, right? So this looks way more complicated than what it needs to be. Again, once you do it once, I think that you'll find it's a pretty straightforward concept that is just understanding what you're seeing in the graphs. Okay, last concept for the day here. I have a long run aggregate supply curve. I have a long run Phillips curve. Okay, so we're going to say that basically no matter what, if we want to call our full employment rate 5%, 4%, 3%, whatever we want to call it, I went with 5% today, that this long run Phillips curve never ever moves. Okay, so let's just say, right, that we have a situation. Let's say that we have a recessionary gap. Okay, and this will be a little bit of a review too. Let's say that we have this recessionary gap. Okay, right here. There's our recessionary gap. Okay, for whatever reason that has been caused. Okay, so a decrease in demand, and we're going to eventually, get things figured out. Remember, okay, if the government does nothing, and it's been some time since we talked about this, think in your brain, if the government does nothing, what eventually happens to our aggregate demand graph? Hopefully you're saying, well, eventually people can't go to work, right? And eventually they're going to change deciding to go to work. Remember, when this recessionary gap, when that creates unemployment, we've got some automatic stabilizers in place. Okay, specifically unemployment insurance and even other welfare programs that you qualify for if you make less money. So these people that lose their jobs, when we increase this unemployment over here, okay, we know that some people eventually will say, okay, I can't collect these benefits anymore. Maybe I'm bored. Maybe, I decide, or some people graduate high school and college and are looking for jobs too, right? And so all of a sudden people become willing to accept lower wages. And when those people accept lower wages, remember, wages are an input to production. Inputs to production affect our supply curve. Okay, so remember, if the government does nothing, all right, we're always going to come back to this long run aggregate supply, right? We're going to shift things back over to the right in this case. Our long run Phillips curve never, ever, ever changes. Okay, we're going to hold it there. Even if we have a technological advance, and like I said in my previous graphs, labeling those with percentages isn't a perfect way of doing it, because if we say, okay, if there's an increase in technology and we shift our long run aggregate supply over to the right because we're able to produce more, right, then you'd say, okay, well, that's going to decrease unemployment, right? And you can't necessarily think that way. Okay, you've got to think about this being frozen in time. And again, the question here isn't necessarily what happens in a technological advance and we have a decrease in demand, right? We have this situation here where we're kind of locked in. The government does nothing. We're always going to return back to this 5% unemployment, no matter what our inflation rate is, right? Our original inflation was here, whatever that is, 5%, 3%, 12%, whatever, right? So if that's our original inflation, well, our new inflation, let's just label it 12%. Okay, let's label this 6%. Well, look at our graph over here, right? So if this is 12%, Over here, here's 6%. Okay, it makes our graph perfect. Long run Phillips curve, just leave it be. Okay, it's an easy one to remember. Okay, it's easier to remember just to keep it put than the other things. All right, we're going to give you a practice problem here, and then we will cut you loose. Okay, here's your question here. It's not a perfect way of doing things, but maybe screenshot it on your computer, okay? I'll read it to you once. Show an economy operating in long-run equilibrium on a graph. Assume that economy is operating at 4% unemployment, 6% inflation. Indicate that point on a long-run Phillips curve and short-run Phillips curve. If the central bank raises the discount rate, show how that affects the following: your money market graph, your aggregate demand graph with your price level and output, and show a new point labeled Y, the new level of inflation and unemployment on your Phillips curve. Okay, pause this, try to draw that out. I'll come back with the answer. Okay, step by step here. First of all, we need an economy in long run equilibrium. Here we are. Okay, now notice I took some time. I labeled the price level equilibrium, the output equilibrium. Some of you guys are doing that a little bit better job than others. Make sure you're getting in the habit of doing that. I haven't done a very good job of holding you accountable for that. But anyway, make sure that you are maintaining some of those things. Okay, so if you didn't start out with this, okay, start out with that. Okay, we're going to move on to number 2. All righty, we've got some numbers here we've got to plug in onto a long run and short run Phillips curve. Okay, so we've got to label some things on this long run, short run Phillips curve. Now, notice I didn't put any percentage over here. Remember, those percentages I put for unemployment, employment, that's just kind of a cheat. You don't really want to do that. You can maybe do that. I would use scrap paper to do it, but I would maybe guess, too, that it might confuse the grader eventually also if you were to do some of those things. Okay, so anyway, we know that we have 4% unemployment, right? We put that up in our problem. Okay, so how do we find 4% unemployment over here? Well, we're a long run equilibrium, right? Long-run aggregate supply, long-run Phillips curve, they're kind of the same thing. All right, they're not identical, but they're kind of the same thing. So we've got 4% unemployment in our long-run equilibrium. So we know that this spot right here has to be 4%. Okay, 4% at this particular point right here. All right, it also says show us 6% inflation. Okay, so how are we going to do that? In a perfect world, I would have drawn up perfectly matching things. I'll make my line a little bit better. Okay, we could attach those if we wanted to. We really don't need to be honest. Okay, but again, it kind of helps us get through things here, especially through not having too much practice. Okay, so how do we say that that's 6%? Very simple. We label it 6%. Okay, so this is our point right here. All righty, that's our 6% inflation, our 4% unemployment. Those numbers I got right there. And we're ready to move forward. Go ahead and do the next step. See if you can come up with what we're trying to do. If you're stuck on that, hopefully you can use the graphs if you got these wrong, and you can add to it to help yourselves out. Okay, moving on to number 3 here, where it says if the central bank raises the discount rate. Hopefully, remembering back to what you guys did a few days ago, raising the discount rate is a contractionary policy, meaning we don't want people to buy stuff. I know we're on long run equilibrium over here, but we're trying to prove a point, right? So anyway, contractionary policy is going to shift our supply of money, right, from the Federal Reserve, the central bank, over to the left, right? And so now people are going to borrow less money because interest rates are going to increase, okay? So we have higher interest rates. Hopefully you got that from number 3. Take a quick second. You're tying in, okay, 3A, right? Here's your money market graph. Now we're saying, all right, supply of money decreases. What's going to happen to the aggregate demand? Go ahead and take a shot at that, and we will touch base in a second. Okay, so we know that interest rates went up. I'm decreasing my aggregate demand over here is hopefully what you're remembering. So I've got a new short run equilibrium. All right, labeling that AD1 there. I've got a new short run equilibrium. It says what's happened to my price level and output. Well, my price level's decreased. My output has decreased. Okay, and the last part that it's showing us here is show on our graph, okay, on our Phillips curve, what that does. Okay, so we know that inflation's got to go down and unemployment's got to go up, right? Because our output went down. So our new point on our new graph is going to be anywhere down below this spot will work. Okay, we'll match it up kind of right there. And it says label it Y. I'm going to label that Y so they know that I'm showing them what I want to show them. Right? Okay. And that is about it. If you can get through that problem, even if you redid it again, okay, if you can get through that, you're going to be in really good shape. Okay. And we'll kind of talk later this week about some things to expect on the test, which I'm taking guesses to about what's going to be on there. Sorry for the longer video today. I knew it was going to be a little bit longer. I'll make the assignment a little bit shorter for what we're doing. Okay, a quick little my AP thing. Okay, missing you guys. I'm hoping you guys are sticking with it, staying motivated. That's the big key through. That's the big key through all this. All of a sudden, about 3 or 4 weeks, you're done. Okay, with solid 4 weeks, and you're done with at least AP macro. Okay, so keep it up. All right, you guys that are turning stuff in, it's been awesome. It's been really good. Even with the mistakes, sometimes we learn from mistakes. So keep that stuff up. We will be in touch. Don't hesitate to ask questions. Don't if you find some motivation, find some supplemental stuff. Okay, I think that might be the big difference between extra success and being close to being where you're at.